We'd be discussing your work, your duty. We'll come on to that. But today, you've chosen to speak out for the first time. Why have you decided?
At 6:34 a.m. on December 2nd, a palace security coordinator received a phone call that made his hands go cold. Within the hour, senior royals would gather in a windowless room at Buckingham Palace to hear what investigators had found inside a storage unit Andrew had been paying for under a false name. The discovery would send tremors through the monarchy so severe that even William, usually unshakable, would be seen pressing his fingers against his temples, absorbing a reality none of them had wanted to face. The discovery. The discovery didn't happen by accident. For months, financial auditors conducting a routine review of expenditures connected to the York household had noticed irregular payments, small amounts, never more than a few £100s at a time, routed through an account registered to a name no one recognized. At first, the discrepancies seemed minor, possibly clerical errors or legitimate expenses misfiled during Andrew's chaotic relocation from Royal Lodge. But when a junior analyst cross-referenced the payment dates with Andrew's known movements, a troubling pattern emerged. The charges originated from a commercial storage facility in Berkshire, a quiet market town 40 minutes from Windsor, and the payments had been ongoing for nearly 7 years. By late November, the auditors brought their findings to the palace's legal office, a division accustomed to handling sensitive matters with surgical discretion. The lead counsel, a woman who had spent 2 decades navigating royal crises, reviewed the documents with growing unease. Storage facilities were not inherently suspicious, but the timing was. The account had been opened shortly after Andrew's disastrous BBC interview in 2019, just as public scrutiny around his associations with Jeffrey Epstein reached its peak. And the payments, though modest individually, had never stopped, not even after Andrew lost his titles, not even after he was forced from Royal Lodge. When the matter reached William's desk on November 29th, his reaction was immediate and sharp. He convened a private meeting with Princess Anne and 2 trusted legal advisors in the morning room at Kensington Palace, a space chosen for its distance from the main household staff. The file was thin, just a few pages summarizing the financial trail, but its implications were anything but small. If Andrew had been concealing a storage unit for years, the question wasn't what might be inside. The question was what he feared enough to hide. Anne, reading through the summary with her characteristic speed and precision, set the papers down with a controlled exhale. "This needs to be opened immediately," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Not tomorrow, not next week, today," William agreed. The longer the unit remained sealed, the greater the risk that its contents, whatever they were, could be moved, destroyed, or worse, discovered by someone outside the family's control. By midday, a plan was in motion. A legal representative, accompanied by a security officer and a senior palace administrator, would travel to the Berkshire facility under the pretense of settling outstanding account matters. They would not notify Andrew in advance. They would not seek his permission. The decision, authorized quietly by King Charles after a brief tense phone call with William, was final. The Crown could no longer afford to leave questions unanswered, especially questions tied to a figure whose past had already brought the monarchy to the brink of collapse. The facility itself was unremarkable, a low-slung building with numbered garage-style doors lining a gravel lot. Unit 47 sat near the back, partially obscured by overgrown hedges. When the team arrived just after 2:00 p.m., the manager handed over the access code without hesitation, unaware of the significance of what was about to unfold. The door rolled upward with a metallic groan, and for a moment, the 3 representatives stood in silence, staring into the dim interior. What they found was not what anyone expected. No salacious photographs, no hidden correspondences with notorious figures, nothing that screamed scandal in the tabloid sense. Instead, the unit was filled with filing cabinets, bankers' boxes stacked floor to ceiling, loose folders spilling documents across a folding table, and a single leather briefcase sitting atop a metal shelf. It was a paper archive, meticulously organized, obsessively preserved, and deeply, deeply troubling. The team worked quickly, photographing the space, cataloging visible labels, and removing several boxes deemed most urgent for immediate review. By the time they returned to Buckingham Palace that evening, the winter sun had already set, casting long shadows across the stone courtyard. Upstairs, in a secure conference room rarely used outside of constitutional emergencies, William, Anne, and Camilla waited. Charles, too unwell to attend in person, had been briefed by secure line and had authorized the review to proceed without delay. When the boxes were opened, the room fell into a silence so complete that the scratch of pen on paper felt intrusive. Inside were years of financial records, correspondence with lawyers and advisors, copies of settlement agreements, and detailed logs of payments made to individuals whose names appeared in no official palace records. There were also personal notes, some handwritten, others typed, referencing meetings, phone calls, and arrangements that had never been disclosed to the family or to investigators. One document in particular caught Anne's attention, a memo dated March 2020, shortly after Andrew's withdrawal from public life. It outlined a proposed media strategy, complete with talking points, suggested interview outlets, and a list of individuals who might be persuaded to offer favorable commentary. The strategy had never been implemented, at least not publicly, but its existence revealed something chilling. Andrew had been preparing, planning, and documenting his attempts to rehabilitate his image long after the family believed he had accepted his exile. William's jaw tightened as he read through a separate folder containing correspondence with foreign business contacts, some based in regions with minimal extradition agreements with the United Kingdom. The letters were vague, carefully worded to avoid explicit admissions, but the subtext was unmistakable. Andrew had been exploring options, contingencies, pathways that suggested he feared consequences far greater than loss of title or public standing. Camilla, who had remained quiet throughout the review, finally spoke. "This is not the archive of a man at peace with his decisions," she said, her voice low but certain. "This is the archive of a man preparing for a war he hopes will never come." The implications settled over the room like frost. If Andrew had been concealing this material for years, what else might he have hidden? And more troubling still, if investigators, whether British authorities or international bodies, ever gained access to these records, what narrative would they construct? The palace had spent years attempting to draw a clear line between Andrew's mistakes and the institution's integrity. But this storage unit, with its careful documentation and quiet persistence, blurred that line in ways the family could not ignore. By the time the meeting adjourned near midnight, one decision had been made. The contents of the storage unit would be secured, reviewed in full by the palace's legal team, and assessed for any material that might carry legal, reputational, or security risks. Andrew would be informed, not consulted, and his cooperation would be expected, not negotiated. The era of protecting Andrew by looking away had ended. Now the family would protect itself by looking directly at what he had tried to keep hidden. The years of isolation. To understand why this discovery carried such devastating weight, we must step back to the months and years that preceded it, a period during which Andrew's behavior had grown increasingly erratic, his isolation more complete, and his desperation more visible to those who still bothered to watch. After Andrew's removal from Royal Lodge in late 2025, he had been relocated to a modest property on the Sandringham estate, a far cry from the grand residence he had occupied for decades. The transition had been framed as practical, a necessary adjustment in line with King Charles's modernization efforts. But those close to the situation knew the truth. Andrew had not gone quietly. He had resisted, negotiated, and delayed until the palace finally issued an ultimatum that left no room for interpretation: leave or face complete financial severance. The move had stripped Andrew of more than physical space. It had stripped him of the last visible symbols of his former life. No staff beyond essential security, no grand rooms for entertaining, no sense of relevance within the family structure. He was, for all practical purposes, in internal exile, and the isolation had begun to warp his judgment in ways the family had been slow to recognize. Financial pressures compounded the strain. Though Andrew retained a modest allowance from the Duchy of Lancaster, it was nowhere near sufficient to maintain the lifestyle he had once considered his birthright. Legal fees from the settlement with Virginia Giuffre had drained reserves. Business ventures, always questionable in their viability, had collapsed under the weight of his damaged reputation. And Sarah, once his partner in navigating financial chaos, was now facing her own forced separation from royal provisions. By mid-2025, staff members who occasionally interacted with Andrew reported troubling changes. He had grown defensive, suspicious, prone to long silences followed by sudden bursts of anger. He spoke often of being misunderstood, of a media conspiracy determined to destroy him, of family members who had abandoned him when loyalty mattered most. These were not the complaints of a man seeking redemption. They were the complaints of a man entrenching himself in grievance. King Charles, burdened by his own health challenges and the demands of a fragile early reign, had tried repeatedly to counsel his brother. Private conversations, carefully worded letters, even the involvement of trusted intermediaries, all had been attempted. But Andrew remained unreachable, locked in a mindset that viewed every consequence as persecution rather than accountability. Charles, exhausted and increasingly ill, eventually stepped back, leaving William and Anne to manage the fallout. What the family failed to anticipate was that Andrew's isolation had not made him passive, it made him calculate. And the storage unit in Berkshire was evidence of that calculation. A hidden archive built not in the chaos of crisis, but in the deliberate quiet of a man who believed the next storm was still coming. The signs that something was seriously wrong with Andrew had been accumulating for months, subtle at first, then increasingly impossible to ignore. But in the controlled, tradition-bound world of the monarchy, even glaring red flags could be rationalized away, at least until they couldn't. The first sign came in early 2025, during a routine audit of expenditures tied to Andrew's security detail. The costs had spiked unexpectedly, not because of increased threats, but because Andrew had been traveling more than anyone realized. Short trips, usually just a day or two, to locations that raised quiet alarms among those tracking his movements. Twice to Geneva, once to Dubai, another time to a small coastal town in Spain, known primarily for its expatriate community and lax financial oversight. When questioned, Andrew provided vague explanations. Personal matters, he said, old friends, legal consultations. None of it was technically prohibited. Andrew was a private citizen now, stripped of royal duties. But the pattern troubled the palace's security coordinators. Men in Andrew's position, facing ongoing scrutiny and potential legal exposure, did not typically engage in unexplained international travel unless they were preparing for something. Princess Anne was the first senior royal to voice suspicion. During a February meeting at Gatcombe Park, she reviewed a summary of Andrew's movements and made a characteristically blunt observation. People don't maintain foreign legal counsel unless they believe jurisdiction might become relevant. It was a sharp assessment, one that William initially dismissed as overly cautious. But Anne had been right too many times before to be ignored entirely. The second sign surfaced in late spring when a former aide to Andrew, someone who had worked closely with him during the Royal Lodge years, contacted the palace discreetly. The aide, now employed elsewhere and reluctant to cause trouble, mentioned in passing that Andrew had once asked for help organizing personal files, an unusual request given that Andrew had always relied on staff for administrative tasks. The aide had assumed it was related to the legal settlement, but looking back, the request felt odd. Andrew had been specific about which documents to prioritize, which to copy, and which to store separately from official records. The detail sat in a file for months, unremarkable on its own, until the financial audit revealed the storage unit payments. Suddenly, the aide's recollection took on new significance. Andrew had not been organizing files for convenience. He had been building an archive, and he had been doing it quietly, deliberately, beyond the family's view. Camilla, who had spent years navigating her own reputational rehabilitation, recognized the behavior immediately. During a private conversation with Charles in July, she described it as the actions of someone constructing a defense. Not a legal defense necessarily, but a narrative defense, a counter-story to deploy if the pressure ever became unbearable. Charles, weary and unwilling to believe his brother capable of such calculation, had waved off the concern. But Camilla's instinct, honed by decades of public scrutiny, proved prescient. The warning signs. The third sign came from William's security team in early November. Routine monitoring of online activity linked to royal family members, a practice implemented after numerous cyber threats, flagged unusual search patterns connected to an IP address tied to Andrew's residence. The searches were not illegal, but they were revealing. Queries about extradition law, offshore account structures, media rights in memoir publishing, and legal protections for private correspondence. Individually, the searches could be explained away. Together, they painted a picture of a man researching options, preparing contingencies, and exploring boundaries. William reviewed the report alone in his study at Adelaide Cottage, the winter rain tapping steadily against the windows. He didn't share it with Catherine immediately. He needed time to process what it implied, that Andrew was not simply living quietly in exile, but actively planning for scenarios the family hoped would never materialize. The fourth sign, the one that finally forced action, came in late November, when the financial auditors presented their findings. The storage unit payments were small, but their consistency was damning. 7 years of uninterrupted monthly charges routed through an account that bore no obvious connection to Andrew, but which investigators traced back to him through a series of intermediary steps. The account had been opened in 2019, just weeks after the BBC interview that destroyed Andrew's public standing. The timing was not coincidental. When William and Anne reviewed the findings together, the pieces finally cohered into a terrifying whole. Andrew had not been passively enduring his downfall. He had been documenting it, preserving it, and possibly preparing to control it. And if that archive contained material damaging not just to Andrew, but to the broader family, the monarchy, or individuals still active in public life, the consequences could be catastrophic. Anne's voice was steady but firm. "We cannot leave this unexamined. If Andrew has been building a case, whether for rehabilitation or retaliation, we need to know what he has." William agreed, and 2 days later the team was dispatched to Berkshire. The moment the storage unit was opened, the scale of what Andrew had been concealing became impossible to ignore. But it was not until the boxes were brought back to Buckingham Palace and their contents examined in full that the true terror set in. Inside the secure conference room, the legal team worked through the night, cataloging, photographing, and analyzing document after document. What emerged was not a random collection of personal memorabilia, but a meticulously organized record spanning nearly a decade. Financial statements detailing payments made and received, correspondence with lawyers both British and international, copies of settlement documents, and detailed notes on meetings and phone calls that had never been disclosed to the palace or to authorities. One box contained what appeared to be a partial diary, not a traditional journal, but a record of events, conversations, and interactions written in Andrew's own hand. The entries were sporadic, spanning from 2015 through early 2024, and they revealed a man acutely aware of his deteriorating position. Some entries were defensive, justifying past decisions and relationships. Others were bitter, lashing out at family members, advisors, and media figures he believed had betrayed him. And a few, the ones that worried the legal team most, hinted at information Andrew believed could be leveraged if circumstances ever demanded it. William read one entry dated August 2020, written shortly after Andrew's withdrawal from public duties. "If they want to bury me," he had written, "they should remember I was not alone in those rooms, at those events. Others knew, others participated, others looked away." The entry didn't name individuals, but the implication was clear. Andrew believed he had been made a scapegoat, and he had retained documentation he thought might prove it. Anne, Reviewing a separate folder containing correspondence with foreign contacts, found letters that referenced potential book deals, documentary opportunities, and media partnerships. None had been pursued, at least not publicly, but their existence confirmed Camilla's earlier suspicion. Andrew had been exploring ways to reshape his narrative, and he had been considering options that bypassed traditional palace oversight entirely. The most disturbing discovery came near the bottom of the third box, a sealed envelope marked simply CYA, a colloquialism the legal team immediately recognized: cover your A's. Inside were photocopies of emails, text message screenshots, and meeting notes involving individuals whose names carried weight both within the royal household and in British political circles. The documents did not contain explicit admissions of wrongdoing, but they revealed a web of communication, coordination, and decision-making that had never been made public. Camilla, reading through the material with a lawyer at her side, felt a cold dread settle over her. If this ever became public, she said quietly, it would not simply damage Andrew. It would implicate the institution. It would suggest that senior figures knew more than they admitted, that decisions were made collectively, that the line between Andrew's actions and the family's complicity was far blurrier than anyone wanted to acknowledge. William stood, pacing the length of the room. His frustration was palpable, not directed at the team, but at the situation itself. Andrew had not been protecting himself out of innocence. He had been protecting himself out of fear, and in doing so, he had created a cache of material that could detonate under the entire family if mishandled or misunderstood. By dawn, the legal team presented their preliminary assessment. The documents posed significant reputational risk. Several items might be subject to legal discovery if ongoing investigations intensified, and the existence of the archive itself, if ever revealed publicly, would raise questions the palace could not easily answer. Why had Andrew felt the need to preserve such detailed records? What did he fear? And what, if anything, had the family known about his activities during the years covered by the archive? Charles, briefed by a secure call from Sandringham, listened in silence. When the call ended, those present reported that he had said only one thing: "This ends now. Andrew will be informed that the contents of the unit are now under palace control. He will not negotiate, he will comply." The decision marked a turning point. The family had spent years attempting to manage Andrew's fallout through distance, through silence, through the quiet hope that time would dull the damage. But the storage unit had revealed a truth they could no longer avoid. Andrew had never accepted his exile. He had been preparing all along for the possibility that he might need to fight back, and the weapons he had assembled were aimed not just at his enemies, but at everyone who had failed to stand beside him. The confrontation. The days following the discovery unfolded with a grim efficiency that marked every royal crisis managed behind palace walls. Andrew was summoned to Buckingham Palace on December 4th, not for a family meeting, but for what staff internally called a notification session, a polite term for a conversation in which only one person speaks and the other listens. William and Anne conducted the meeting in a small private office overlooking the gardens. Charles, still unwell and advised to avoid stressful confrontations, participated by secure video link, his face pale but resolute on the monitor mounted discreetly on the wall. Andrew entered the room alone, his posture defensive before a single word was spoken. The conversation lasted less than 20 minutes. William, speaking with the calm authority of a future king, informed Andrew that the storage unit had been located, its contents secured, and a full legal review was underway. Andrew was not asked to explain. He was told, plainly and without ambiguity, that the archive was now palace property, and that any attempt to access, remove, or replicate the material would be considered a breach of family trust and potentially a legal matter. Andrew's reaction, according to those present, was a mixture of shock and simmering anger. He insisted the documents were personal, that he had every right to preserve his own records. Anne cut him off. "Your rights," she said evenly, "do not extend to creating liabilities for the Crown." William added more gently but no less firmly that the family was not accusing Andrew of wrongdoing, but that the contents of the unit had raised questions that required careful management, questions, he emphasized, that could not be left unanswered if external investigators ever came looking. Charles, speaking from the screen, broke his silence only once. "Andrew," he said quietly, "this is not negotiable." The meeting ended with Andrew leaving in rigid silence. Staff who observed his departure noted that his hands were clenched, his expression unreadable. He did not speak to anyone as he exited the palace grounds. Within the week, the palace legal team completed their review. Certain documents deemed sensitive but not immediately dangerous were archived under restricted access protocols. Others, those containing potential legal exposure or material that could complicate ongoing investigations, were flagged for discreet consultation with external counsel. And a small subset of the material, the entries hinting at broader family knowledge or involvement, were sealed entirely, accessible only by direct authorization from the king. The international implications also required attention. American authorities, still navigating the post-Epstein legal landscape, had made clear in recent months that certain lines of inquiry remained active. The palace quietly retained counsel in New York to assess whether any material in Andrew's archive might fall under subpoena risk. The answer, while not definitive, was troubling enough that contingency protocols were put in place. For Sarah Ferguson, the discovery added yet another layer to her already impossible position. Though she had not been directly implicated in the archive's contents, her proximity to Andrew meant she would inevitably be drawn into any broader scrutiny. Her daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, accelerated plans for her relocation to Portugal. Understanding that distance, both geographic and symbolic, was now essential. By mid-December, the immediate crisis should have been contained, but the scars it left would be deep. William and Anne had seen, in stark documentation, the extent of Andrew's isolation and desperation. Charles had been forced to confront the reality that his attempts to protect his brother had, in some ways, enabled behaviors that now threatened the institution. And Camilla, ever the realist, understood that this would not be the last time Andrew's past came back to haunt them. The storage unit had been emptied, secured, and quietly closed. But the questions it raised about loyalty, about accountability, about how far a family should go to protect one of its own, lingered like smoke in a closed room. The aftermath. As December deepened and the palace grounds grew quieter under winter's grip, the story of Andrew's secret storage unit settled into the long, complicated history of royal scandals, family fractures, and desperate attempts to control narratives that refused to stay contained. What this moment revealed, more than anything, was a truth that extends far beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace. Secrets, no matter how carefully preserved, do not protect us. They calcify into liabilities, waiting for the moment when someone, somewhere, decides to look closer. Andrew believed he was building a defense, an archive to prove his side of the story if circumstances ever demanded it. But what he actually created was a map of his fears, his resentments, and his refusal to accept accountability. And maps, once discovered, can be read by anyone. For families everywhere, royal or otherwise, the lesson is sobering. When one member chooses concealment over honesty, isolation over transparency, the consequences ripple outward, touching everyone connected to them. Andrew's storage unit did not just threaten his future. It threatened his daughters, his ex-wife, his brother, and an institution built over centuries. The weight of what he hid became a burden the entire family now carried. And yet there is another truth worth acknowledging. Andrew is a man who has lost nearly everything: title, standing, purpose, and the desperate measures he took, however misguided, reflect a kind of human fragility that should not be dismissed entirely. Fear drives people to extremes. Shame distorts judgment. And isolation, the kind Andrew has lived with for years, can turn even reasonable minds toward paranoia and self-preservation at any cost. For the monarchy, this chapter marks yet another painful reckoning. The crown has spent years trying to modernize, to adapt, to prove its relevance in a world that increasingly demands transparency. But how do you modernize an institution built on discretion when the very act of concealment becomes a crisis? The answer, it seems, is painfully simple. You cannot protect your way out of accountability. You can only face it, document it, and hope that honesty, however delayed, will eventually rebuild what secrecy has eroded. As the lights dimmed over Buckingham Palace tonight and staff filed out into the cold December air, one question lingered in the silence. If Andrew had kept this much hidden, what else might still be waiting to be found? And perhaps more importantly, will the family ever truly know the full extent of what he feared? Or will there always be another box, another unit, another envelope marked with initials? Only he understands. Thank you for staying with this story. In the end, the fall of a prince is not just about titles or scandal. It is about the choices we make when we believe no one is watching, and the moment when we discover that someone always is.